In this episode, we are exploring the Exposition Underground. Utilities, services, foundations, and a few extras along the way. A monumental undertaking to build out this entire exposition and the infrastructure to support it. So, thank you for joining me, and welcome to another exploration of the Columbian Exposition of 1893. Let's begin with an article from The Star, Reynoldsville, Pennsylvania, May 17th, 1893. It reads as follows. It must be understood that the Exposition is a city with a complete government. There are over 50,000 exhibitors, and 2 persons for each interest represented would give a fixed population of 100,000. There are well-organized and equipped police and fire departments. The Columbian Guard is an independent body of police numbering in the neighborhood of 2,000 men, largely made up of ex-soldiers. This body is commanded by Colonel Edmund Price of the United States Army, and all of its superior officers are detailed from the Army. The men are uniformed like soldiers, wear short swords, and are under strict military discipline. They present a fine appearance scattered about the grounds. Police and fire stations are placed at strategic points, and the floors of all the buildings are patrolled night and day as a protection against fire. So how very interesting. A city with a complete government, well organized and equipped. Police and fire departments that have strategic points and are patrolled day and night against fire. The Columbian Guard also being a private military, essentially, at the grounds. Is this the kind of presence that is still being implemented at world expositions today? Now here's some interesting notes on the Columbian Guard, quoted here from a book referenced in a previous episode, History of the World's Fair. The Columbian Guard is a military organization under the control and direction of the Exposition Company, having no connection with the Chicago Police Department. To be sure, these guards have been abused and caricatured for the severe performance of their duty. They have been sworn at, reviled, and knocked down. They have not only arrested disreputable and suspicious persons, but they have even placed department chiefs, directors, and commissioners under arrest and trotted off their own commandant to headquarters for attempting to do what he himself had forbidden. Additionally, we have the Guard in action within this next segment that states, up to the opening day, the Columbian Guard had extinguished or helped extinguish 284 fires, and on one occasion saved machinery building from complete destruction. While the splendid conduct of the guards on the day of the destruction of the cold storage building elicited general commendation, it is not improbable that the guards perform their duties in a too severely civil way to suit many not all acquainted with or used to military discipline and feigned insensibility of discriminating powers. But all the same, they have been faithful and vigilant from the first to last, and the Exposition Company has been greatly the gainer by their effective patrol, ambulance, and fire department work. Overall, we have documents indicating a city with its own governance, police, fire, medical, and private military under the control of the Exposition Company, not to mention the absolute non-stop pyromaniacs at this event. 284 fires seems excessive, yet it is something we cannot dispute. It is simply an interesting piece of information within this section. The infrastructure for the services must have been immense, and was indicated in the very last section of the previous episode. While Jackson Park was being excavated, All services were being laid in underground subways or service tunnels that were custom built to run beneath the exposition itself. A truly incredible feat to undertake for this event. Looking at this image, which is sourced from Campbell's Illustrated History, we have a construction image of the electric subway. It appears to be a photograph, and we do not have a real indication of location. Some curious aspects to point out before moving on. The building on the left, what stage of construction would this be? We have missing windows, which appear completely random, not as if they are systematically working in any sequential order to install them at all. Additionally, the coloring is all over the place. We have sections that are discolored that rise up many meters on the walls and sections on the pillars. It's almost backwards in terms of finishing, from top to bottom. And is that a clue as to what type of photograph or image this is? Is this construction or destruction? Why are there ladders placed against pillars? It seems like an incredibly foolish way to work on a rounded surface. This clearly looks unfinished, and if this was under construction, why is there no scaffolding or any indication of this building being worked on? We do see piles of wood nearby, however, that seems to be designated for this electrical subway. Something that is curious in the development of this intricate underground set of systems that includes power, gas, water, drainage, and sewage is that we have images that show many telephone poles that are installed around almost completed buildings. In the initial stages of construction, it would seem advantageous to have telephone poles potentially to aid in powering the construction process, whatever that may mean. Do we have any indications of these lines running into a service corridor that would go underground? Some sort of maintenance box that would be accessible in each building at multiple points? Why would these large poles still be in place around almost completed buildings? Are they running power to other areas of the park? Potentially something to consider. Additionally, digging down at least 6 feet into what has repeatedly been described as a marshy wasteland with ridgy sandbars, these corridors must have been strategically placed in order to be impermeable. How did they keep these sections clear of any leaks? What types of supports were used to ensure these did not cave in or buckle under the pressure of dirt or possible pedestrian traffic? Maybe we can get a better look with the next few images from the Ryerson and Burnham archives. This collection being part of a massive catalog that will be essential to this exploration moving forward. This is an image of the supposed underground services within the grounds. It is merely labeled as subway piping near 1000 HP. Unsure if that has any significance, and really unsure if this is representing anything at this event. Maybe some aspects to consider with this image. Does this service work appear new? The image is dated to 1893, so these should be immaculate. Is that what is represented here? Let's check out another one here. This image is dated for 1893 and does not have any notes other than the title of the image, which is World's Columbian Exposition, Electrical Subway. So what can we decipher? It is clearly a long corridor judging by the lighting hanging from the ceiling, which would be expected as this event covers several hundred acres of land. This appears to be primarily electrical in nature. On either side, we have maybe wood beams that are vertical, which might show some weathering or look a bit beat up. Now, if you were building this subway, using damaged pieces would be the best option. No one will see them. They are merely for support. So, is that what we are looking at here? Rough cut beams with some damaged sides? Or are we looking at more weathered material? Additionally, we have individual lines or even sections of this electrical wiring that appear to be unused. Some of these glass elements are different in size. Is this on purpose or for a specific voltage, specific lines? Let's move on and take a look at our final image and then review some aspects of what these scenes depict in general. This image is from 1893 and is labeled Power Plant Subway, most likely under machinery building. Interesting how the location of these images is unknown. What we can decipher is that this indeed appears like a larger station, or section rather, of the corridor that was shown in the earlier image of construction. One difference being that the photo showing the construction clearly indicates that there is a floor. It is a corridor entirely made out of wood. Yet this image shows the opposite. This appears to be just dirt. Is it possible that they could not build all corridors as shown in the time frame? Again, possible, but unlikely, as it would become an issue of safety and overall operation of the fair, in my opinion. We also have some additional pipes running horizontally in the frame that run overhead of anyone walking down here. Unsure of what those may be. Now check this main line or pipe here. This image is supposed to be taken at the beginning of this event. All of these services and materials should be fresh, newly minted and ready for installation and usage. Yet look at the weathering on this line. In all honesty, it looks aged, and that might be putting it lightly. This looks almost ancient in a sense. And what type of material is this? It does appear that there is a welding mark along the top which would indicate some sort of steel or metal. Unfortunately, the resolution is not great. At first glance, it almost appeared as stone that had been weathered away from erosion. Do steel or metal pipes erode in this manner? It is certainly very curious. After the initial viewing of these images, here are some questions to consider while looking at another additional image of an electrical subway east of the lagoon. The underground work for all of the mentioned services would have been immense. Look at just the wiring in the small section of those images, for example. So let that be the first inquiry. How much wiring would be required to kit this event out? Kilometers? Tens of kilometers? What about the materials to manufacture this wiring? The copper, the casing, the spools? Consider the glass or possibly porcelain insulators that we see in this image alone. There's roughly 50 in this section. What are the logistics of manufacturing hundreds, thousands, or potentially tens of thousands of these insulators? This is a monumental amount of material just for the underground electrical system. And remember, this was only the underground sections. This exposition was wired up. Buildings, canals, fountains, the basin, walkways. This entire event was an incredible achievement in electrical prowess. According to plans adopted for lighting, the buildings and grounds provide for 138,218 electric lamps, of which 6,766 are to be arc lamps of 2,000 candle power each, and 131,452 incandescent, 16 candle power each. The electric lighting will cost something like $1.5 million and will be 10 times as extensive as was employed at the Paris Exposition. The light and motive plant at the Exposition, it is estimated, will require 26,000 horsepower, of which 22,000 will be required for the electric plant. Additionally, we have all of the pipelines that would be required for this corridor and event in general: sewage, drainage, water, and gas. It always comes back to logistics, and that's where these issues become less probable. How much steel would be required to establish this type of infrastructure? How long would it take to manufacture this material? Who installed it, and how many workers would it require to install this system effectively and efficiently? What about testing, pressurizing, ensuring there were no leaks? Was there someone in charge of checking these systems, walking the corridors underground? Or did this monumental system of services work impeccably after installation? Let's refer back to our initial plans regarding these systems. To supply the exposition buildings and grounds with water, 2 plants are being put in. One with capacity of 24 million gallons a day, and the other of 40 million gallons. Thus, 64 million gallons a day will be available. The pumping, works, and all of the great machinery furnishing power to the exposition will be open to inspection of visitors. A system for drainage, believed to be adequate and perfect, has been adopted. Perfect sewage 2 is planned. All refuse from cafes and kitchens, and from the lavatories and closets, of which 6,500 will be constructed at an expense of some 450,000, will be received by injectors and forced by compressed air through underground pipes into 4 huge tanks, where it will be treated chemically and rendered entirely inoffensive. Work upon these systems is progressing. Some incredible numbers to consider here: 6,500 areas to potentially plumb, which will be an essential service that has tens of millions of gallons flowing through it every day. Let's view some images that depict the machinery required to accomplish this task. As mentioned, all of this technology was on display or open for public consumption, allowing visitors to view and peruse the various equipment used throughout the exposition. We begin here with a supposed construction image, this one labeled as the Alice engine, with an additional note that reads machinery building, boilers, Arnold view, unknown. Arnold being the photographer, yet the term unknown just casually thrown in there at the end. Will we come across any other unknown imagery? Foreshadowing. So this is apparently boilers that are being installed within the machinery building. First detail that is not in the image, but the actual dating, is unknown. It is labeled as ND, which may mean not disclosed, not dated, not decided. That is unknown, at least to myself. Next, we have these almost blinding highlight spots that have obscured the upper portions above these boilers. It is curious that if this was sunlight, we would have a similar effect on the skylight in the top left of the image. As a photographer for one of the most prestigious events in American history, it is puzzling why Arnold would shoot a photo from this angle. Usually, when photographing a subject, it is always wise to use the light to your advantage, basically standing so the sun in this case would be behind you. Now, this may be problematic as we may not get the intended subject we wanted by adjusting for light, and that could be the case for this image. Overall, these spots seem overly bright and blown out. Next was this placement of these two valves on the floor. It seems unusual to install something of this nature, a literal valve and something you may need access to at some point, to be installed in the ground. Surely there would be access panels, yet this seems unnecessary. Was it done specifically for this machinery? Maybe there is some logical application or purpose that these valves were installed this specific way. That is unknown. However, maybe someone has a bit more knowledge that could comment below. Additionally, we have this strange circular object that may look familiar. Now, this may be a stretch, however, this object looks vaguely similar to what was beside the underground pipe in the subway system in an earlier image. Maybe this has a simple connection, however, in both images it does appear worn or aged. Now, moving on to our next image that is dated for 1893. Again, part of the Ryerson and Burnham collection and shot by Arnold, CD. This is an exterior image of the machinery building or machinery hall. No notes of any importance with this one. This image was interesting and felt it represented contrast as was discussed in the last presentation. Nothing with the composition of the image itself, rather the buildings. This will definitely be a topic for a future episode and may require its own episode in its entirety, and that topic is branding. To keep it brief for this example, it is the consistency of an entity's persona, its messaging, its media or correspondence, its products, its overall image. It could be a company, a person, a city, or a world's exposition. We see that there was significant effort poured into the creation of these magnificent buildings, yet this area in comparison could almost be described as simply slapped together. Is it possible the timeline simply was too short and they had to make do? Maybe this is an area that is largely unseen by the public. Was it simply unnecessary to build in an elaborate manner? Was this an addition to structures that already existed? That's up for you to decide. Before moving on, one last detail on this image. It is possibly a trick of light, yet this circular porthole looks to be lacking a window. Our next image is labeled as the boiler room in the machinery building. Unfortunately, the date of object or view as stated on the site is ND. Again, the note on this image states, again, machinery building, boiler room, Arnold view, unknown. Surely this must be 1893 as this looks completed and operational. Is it not? Let's run down some details of this image. The first minor detail is the blurring of these two spots on the upper right of the image. Maybe this is steam or some sort of exhaust. Certainly unusual and almost an eerie similarity to one of the previous images of the boiler room. So on to the main focus of this image, the bricks. Looking around this image, we can see that the unit on the right is at least outlined in brick. The wall or mid-floor on the left is comprised of brick, and the entire floor of this room is laid with brick. Not to mention the circular detail at the top of these boilers. Alright, imagery such as this begins to present some serious, logistically heavy projects. It pushes the probability of the actual historical account further into obscurity. Not to mention the strange inconsistency of our previous image showing that valves and pipes were installed And then was this brickwork placed on top of it? Around it with the service area maybe? What would be the reasoning for what was shown in this image versus the completed one? Unfortunately, the quality of the imagery from this gallery is not great, and I'm working on getting higher resolution images to clarify some of these details. Is it possible that even the back wall, directly in the middle of this image, is also brickwork? With the magnitude of the brickwork shown in this single image, it most certainly adds an additional element of time, craftsmanship, labor, production, transportation, and just general logistics. In saying all of that, it is possible this area had to be reinforced, as tons of equipment would be resting within this specific area. A suitable foundation would be required for such a display. Yet then the question surfaces again of being temporary. All of this engineering, this construction, this intricate maze of pipes and valves, this technology, it could not be repurposed for any other need within the growing city of Chicago? Suppose none of that matters when a massive conflagration is lurking in the near future for this event. I'll showcase a few more images that I gathered while researching and read a section from a book called The Book of the Fair regarding this boiler system. The boilers are all of the water tube type, which in brief consists of a bank of tubes a few inches in diameter and a dozen feet long, inclined upward and connected with a large steam drum or reservoir. The tubes are expanded at either end, and the entire apparatus is filled with warm water up to about the middle of the drum. As the steam is generated by the flames beneath, it passes from each pair of battery of boilers into one common pipe, which delivers it in turn to the headers, or reservoirs, located under the gallery floor. The water is then drained from the headers and returned to the boilers for further use by a separate system of pipes. To boilers of this pattern, it is claimed that even an explosion causes but little damage, since the enormous power which they generate is distributed between 11 or 12,000 tubes. After the plant was put in operation, several of the tubes were burst, and yet without serious injury. The boilers are all operated on the same general principle, consuming about 12,000 gallons of oil an hour, and evaporating more than 100,000 gallons of water, generated in these monster batteries and emptied into the headers under the gallery. The steam is conveyed to the engines in Machinery Hall. So after reading this section initially, the usage of oil was just interesting. So 12,000 gallons per hour, that is 288,000 gallons per day, which equates to roughly 8,640,000 gallons of oil per month. And to run this exposition for roughly 6 months, that would total roughly 51,840,000 gallons of oil. And that's just a fun fact. Let's continue on reading. The oil is stored in iron tanks enclosed in a massive brick vault in the southeastern portion of the grounds, and with a total capacity of 112,000 gallons. This subterranean reservoir is in 6 compartments, each twice the size of the tanks, and thus is avoided or minimized the danger of explosion should the grounds be swept by fire. That would certainly be unfortunate if the grounds were swept by fire. After reading through much of this section regarding the powering and fueling of the exposition, there was this sentence that explained a question raised earlier in the presentation. Looking at this construction image, it was strange how these pipes and valves were in the ground. We have here some confirmation or at least clarification as to why this was done. It reads as follows. The main lines of supply pipes are enclosed in a heavy wooden box covered by removable cast iron plates, with branches leading to the boilers which furnish power for several groups of engines, presently to be described. Now, looking back at the second image that was shown, we can clearly see this section of supposed wood that would have been covered by steel plates. Next, we have an image from the publication called The Photographic World's Fair and Midway Plaisance. This may sound familiar, as this book was referenced in the last presentation for the contrast demonstration near the end. It was also the same book that threw shade on other publishers for not providing credible perspectives, then continuing to boast that their book was a better representation of the event. Yet the one image from that book we inspected was riddled with illustrations, which would, in my opinion at least, reduce the credibility of your publication. You can almost taste the irony. Moving on, this image is representing the boiler room, and despite the illustrated people, the clear highlights on the boilers, the illustrated flags, the illustrated ribbons, the highlights on the machinery, the highlights on the pipes, the distorted flooring, which we now know as brickwork, the grainy background, and overall horrendous quality of this image, we read the caption below. The boiler room of Machinery Hall was a sight worth seeing for the student of modern industrial methods. Here was arranged the greatest battery of boilers in the world, the illustration showing its enormous length. No coal was used, the fuel supplied being entirely of kerosene oil. The soul of Watts would have been delighted with the spectacle. An interesting data point, as this was considered the greatest battery of boilers, which has been referenced before in these books. This was one instance specifically here. Note the use of the word illustration once again. There's an increasing number of the greatest or the biggest going on at this exposition. The largest building in the world. The first and largest Ferris wheel in the world, the largest battery of boilers in the world, the largest amount of electrical lights at an exposition, the most visitors, the biggest footprint in terms of acreage. And what is this here? Oh, it's just the world's greatest dynamo, which was the largest ever constructed for the generation of electrical power. We are going to read this section about the Intramural Railroad Company's dynamo. It may be desirable to many, however, to know just what an electric dynamo is. In 1864, 30 years ago, the Italian Pacchinetti described in a scientific journal an electromagnetic machine and said it could be used to generate electricity by applying power to revolve the armature. Nothing came of it at the time, but in 1873, at the Vienna Exposition, somebody accidentally picked up and attached to the terminals of an electromagnetic machine the ends of two wires which were lying on the ground. These two wires happened at that moment to be attached to another similar machine that was running by steam power. The idle machine began to move like the other, then became known what very strangely was not known before or revealed by investigation, and the revolutionary twins were born, the dynamo and the motor, which are together changing the aspect of the civilized world. And with that, your desire to know how the dynamo came to be should be satiated. No details left out, with a crystal clear explanation. As for this picture, it's hard to decipher what is happening here. There is some indication of illustrative strokes on the gears or wheels in the background of the image. Is this a construction photo before the fair? Possibly maintenance or repairs? Or maybe somebody is at it again, fiddling with wires and different machines to invent the next best technological advancement for the upcoming expositions. Let's move on before somebody gets out of hand. This next image is taken from a publication called The Book of the Fair. We see a man standing beside a machine known as the Westinghouse Railway Generator. Initially, there are indications of manipulation, specifically with the upper metal structures, appearing mostly illustrated in this image. That is not the main focus, however. The most curious aspect of this image is the bricked section around this machine, which is roughly 5 to 6 feet deep, at least, and that is what we can visibly see. This brings up another line of questioning about the temporary nature of this event. When reviewing the amount of machinery present and on display at this event, what kind of structural supports were in place to ensure these machines didn't sink into the swampy wasteland that was Jackson Park? Were certain sections built with brick, like this image indicates, in order to house specific machinery? Understandably, this would make the most sense to build with a more durable material should the machinery require that type of foundation or protection should anything go wrong. Now consider what we just viewed with the annex of the machinery hall containing all of the boilers. The foundation or base level was entirely comprised of brick. Is it possible that the machinery hall was of the same treatment? It's difficult to get any more details from this image specifically, as the floor has been manipulated and illustrated over. And that is, of course, up to you to decide. Speaking of structural foundations, from here was the line of research into the chief engineer of the world's Columbian Exposition, Edward C. Shankland. A quick search provided an article regarding the Navy Pier in Chicago, which is certainly an incredible engineering project in itself. This excerpt is from yourchicagoguide.com and provides a correlation that linked these two events, or projects, in terms of their initial construction process. It reads as follows. The plan he devised to keep the massive pier stable might have seemed like overkill. Workers drove more than 20,000 Oregon timber pilings between 20 and 27 feet down. Steel tie rods anchored the pilings, which were topped with a concrete foundation that supported the steel columns of the pier's buildings. A triple row of piles supported concrete dock walls. Those were bordered with clay, rock, and sand and were buttressed by loose rock. That thing was not going to move, and it hasn't. What seemed interesting is that many of the buildings at the Columbian Exposition were built in the same manner, using piles, hundreds of them. Strangely, there is limited information about this process in many of the publications used to research this presentation, most just showing an image of what the piles looked like. We have some images of the process of pile driving. Unfortunately, I could only find one clear image of this process that is even labeled, indicating that this was what was happening. Were these piles driven 20 to 27 feet into the ground, as was done for the Navy Pier? Again, unknown. However, this in itself seems like a monumental engineering task. This, like anything during the building process, requires planning, knowledge of structural integrity, and precision. The buildings shown at this event are monumental, even if we do take the historical account at face value. This process would have been laborious, and the material, being wood, is another logistical aspect that seems to be glossed over in these initial stages. Where was all of this wood sourced from? And how long did this endeavor take? Unfortunately, there was no mention thus far as to how many piles were driven, or any in-depth detail of the project in general. We also have imagery of what appears to be a different style of foundational work for the government building, indicated here from the Ryerson and Burnham Art and Architecture Archive. Unsure if this was the process after driving the piles and using these Jenga-styled foundation sections on top. Additionally, there is this image which shows a supposed test for this style of foundation using a section of I-beams arranged in a triangular fashion. It does state on the image that this is for the same building, being the government building. It is hard to discern if this is showing anything meaningful, though. This next image blurs the lines a bit as this triangular section is then dug into the ground and then labeled as a test for foundational support for the manufacturer's building. These images all seem so peculiar. This is the only image that shows these sections of iron in the ground. So was the test successful? Does this even make sense as a structural test? We don't necessarily have a photo of the multiple holes that would be dug for all of these various foundational steel structures. Maybe they tested one and figured that would be fine for the rest, which seems like risky business. Yet I have minimal knowledge in this realm of construction. Before wrapping up this presentation, there was one additional note to bring up in regards to the government building, which will also segue into the next episode's exploration. Was this event temporary, or do we have indications of these formerly treated materials, like this image? Pause the video if you're interested in reading this entire caption, but it is only the last sentence that is relevant here. It is built solidly of brick, iron, and glass, thus being practically fireproof. What are we to make about such a claim? As always, that's up for you to decide. That will be the end of this presentation. And as with the others, I like to leave you with something to ponder after each episode. And this brief section is from Campbell's Illustrated History, and it reads as follows. It is titled, Rapid Work. January 1891. There was not a single sod turned in Jackson Park to mark where the World's Fair was to be held. When this fact is taken into consideration, together with the fact that on May 1st, 1893, the fair was practically complete, insofar as the buildings and grounds were concerned, the amount of labor done in the interval seems almost impossible. In a little over 2 years, a wild tract of land was made to blossom as a garden, and was covered with structures covering hundreds of acres of land. Beautiful lagoons and canals were formed from what was originally a boggy marsh. Paved walks and rustic bridges had taken the place of sand and mire holes, and what was a comparative wilderness only 2 years before was then the most beautiful city on earth. With that, I would like to thank you for your time and hopefully this episode was enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. If you gained any value from this, give the video a like. Let me know what your thoughts are below in the comments. And if you're interested in learning more about the manipulation of historical documents, consider subscribing and learning about it with me.